All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Explore by the Seat of Your Pants event. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I will be your host for today. Really excited for today's event. So, all month long, we have been celebrating our epic Earth. So, talking to scientists and explorers who work all around the world, studying amazing ecosystems, amazing animals, and then, of course, working hard to protect those ecosystems for us. So, today's ecosystem that we're going to dive into is the grassland ecosystem or the prairie ecosystem. And we're really excited to be joined by Daniel Kinka today. So Daniel joined the American Prairie Reserve in 2018 as a restoration ecologist. His work focuses on restoring wildlife at the American Prairie Reserve and affiliated wild sky ranches, as well as being a liaison to neighbors, NGOs, government agencies, and other external entities. So he's also a fellow with the National Geographic Society, using technology like camera traps to monitor large animals like bison and mountain lion. And he was drawn to his work to help ensure that large mammals that he loves have a chance once again to thrive in the great North American prairies. So Daniel, it's so awesome to have you joining live today. We've got classrooms starting to tune in live via YouTube. We've got classrooms and camera with us. We're excited to get to know you a little better. And then of course, they'll fire away with a little Q&A action when the time comes.
That sounds great. Thanks again for having me. This is just, I love doing this kind of stuff, and I'm excited to speak with you all today. So thanks for that introduction, Joe. I guess I don't need to introduce myself. That was great and flattering, and always a little embarrassed to hear myself introduced that way. But yeah, that is true. You guys can call me Danny, and yeah, I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about the prairie ecosystem. So let me just switch over to screen share here, and we'll slide right into my presentation. And then we'll, of course, like, a little too fast here. Okay, so American prairies is what I'm going to talk to you about today. Technically, the grassland ecosystem is a little bit bigger than just what we have in North America, but North America is what I'm most familiar with, so we'll talk about American prairies today. So first, what I want you to do is close your eyes and imagine a prairie. It doesn't matter, there's no right or wrong answer here. Just close your eyes and think, what do you see? If I say the word prairie, what do you imagine in your mind? What do you see? What's there? You got it? Well, is this what you imagine? Lots of bison? Or maybe this? An elk bugling? Maybe it was this, mama grizzly bear and her cubs. The thing is, many people, when you say imagine a prairie or imagine a North American prairie, they just see this. It's just grass. Or this, an old homestead. Maybe this. Maybe they see a cow. This incredible and all too often forgot ecosystem, but we really don't remember what they looked like. At least I don't think we really remember what is a prairie. What's a North American prairie? Now, if I'd asked you to do the same thing and said, imagine a grassland savanna, you might have had an easier time doing that. You might have been able to imagine like a giraffe or a rhinoceros or a wildebeest or something like that. Those are grasslands too. We call them savannas instead of prairies, but it's basically the same thing. Most people have a good, easy time conjuring up images of giraffes and cheetahs and stuff like that. But when it comes to the North American prairies and bison and wolves and grizzly bears and bighorn sheep, it's a little bit of a tougher exercise. So I'm getting ahead of myself just a little bit. First, we have to talk about what is a prairie? What do I mean when I say a prairie or a grassland ecosystem? Well, I kind of mentioned this already, but prairies are essentially, at least for our purposes today, it's synonymous, or it means the same thing as a grassland or a savanna, shrubland, prairie. All these things kind of mean the same thing. What is that? It's just a region of the planet, an ecosystem, a place on Earth that doesn't get too much rainfall. And so instead of trees being the dominant plant on the landscape, we see more things like grasses, lots and lots of different grasses, and then some shrubs, bushes, forbs, things like flowers, things like that, but not a landscape with a lot of trees on it, not a forest, not a mountainous ecosystem, certainly not a marine or an ocean ecosystem, but these are the middle parts of our North American continent that are largely just vast sweeping grasslands. Here you can see a map of what in the United States anyways, we consider to be prairie. And you can see this map shows that there's 3 different kinds of prairies: short grass, mixed grass, and tall grass. All that means is that as you move from west to east across the continent, the grass gets a little taller just because there's a little bit more rainfall. But for our purposes today, we'll call all of that the grasslands or the prairies. And you can see they run from almost Mexico all the way up into Canada, which isn't shown in this map, I apologize, but they run far, way up into Alberta and Saskatchewan as well. It's also important to mention that when we talk about prairie ecosystems, we're talking about the grasslands of the North American continent. If you're familiar with the Louisiana Purchase, actually the Louisiana Purchase included much of the North American grasslands. And of course, we would be remiss, it would be a mistake to not acknowledge the fact that these grassland ecosystems for 10,000 years before white Europeans made it to this continent were occupied by dozens and dozens of Native American or First Nations tribes. You can see some of the names of those tribes here, but this was a thriving place, not just for wildlife, but for people as well, for a long, long time. We're talking 10 to 12,000 years since the last ice age. It's also, of course, and notable for our discussion today, a place that has a huge richness of wildlife. Lots and lots of big animals. If you think of what animals that are iconically North American, chances are that animal, at least at one time, existed on the prairies. Bison being kind of that hallmark species, our national mammal in the United States, and in our great lawnmower of the plains or the prairies of North America, a very, very important animal for keeping grassland ecosystems healthy and robust. We'll talk about that a little bit more. So I've rattled off some of these names for prairie species, but we kind of know what prairies are, right? They're these big, vast grassland systems, but what actually lives there? So we'll start at the bottom ecosystem, the kind of the foundation, the base of that pyramid, if you want to think about it in terms of like a food web or something like that. Prairies are defined by those grassland species that exist out there. Lots and lots of different grassland species, different kinds of grasses. And you might think when you think grass, like, oh, are these the same grasses that live in my front yard or my backyard? Is this, where I play with my dog in the front yard? Well, not really. Sometimes, but not exclusively. Our lawns, and there's quite a bit of lawn in this country and in this continent, would be the grasses that you see on the far left side of this graph that I'm showing you. All the way on the left side, you can see quote unquote turf grass, what usually makes up our lawns. It doesn't grow much more than a foot tall if we don't mow it. And the root systems are less than about a foot deep. So there's not a whole lot of just plant there. It's fairly small. Our native grassland species in North America are all the other plants and many, many more that you see on this graph. They grow multiple feet in height, but most importantly, they have very, very deep root systems. They can grow meters deep or up to 15 feet deep, according to this graph. We see those prairie roots. And so if you think about a prairie plant from the ground up, what you can see while you're out there might not be a whole lot of plant, but there's actually quite a bit underground. You can almost imagine it as an upside down tree. So when we see trees, we see these big towering plants that grow up above the ground with a root system underneath. If we flipped that whole thing upside down, you'd see the roots on top, which oftentimes aren't as long, and a big, huge trunk would be underground. That's kind of how a prairie plant works. They're very important, and there's a lot there, and they do a lot of work and have very complicated root systems, but it's mostly upside down. A lot of that is hidden. And that's very important to how the ecosystem functions. So we have this large biodiversity, or there's lots and lots of different plants. When I say biodiversity, I just mean there's a lot of different things out there, different species when we talk about plants. That supports lots and lots of different animals. If we're talking about birds, it includes all the birds that you see on your screen here, plus many, many, many more birds, way too many for me to fit on one slide. There's a huge bird biodiversity. Again, that's just the number of different species of birds that we see on the plains or in the grasslands, the prairies, that either use the place full time, so are there year round, or migrate in and out. As they're migrating north to south, oftentimes those birds will stop over in the prairie. So that gives us a biodiversity, a richness of bird life that's very, very high, some of the highest that you'll find on the continent. And then, of course, mammals, and I apologize, I skipped over reptiles and herps. There are many turtles and salamander and snake species that I didn't include in this project, but mammals are what I think about the most. And so this slide actually includes all of the large to medium mammals that we would have at least at one time expected to find on the prairies. That includes all of your kind of top of the food chain animals like wolves and cougars and grizzly bears and of course people. And then your smaller mammals, you see a coyote, the swift fox, the little tiny cat-sized endemic fox of the prairies, bobcats, badgers, the black-footed ferret, the most endangered mammal in North America, bison, elk, deer, pronghorn, bighorn sheep, everything is, and all the way down to our lovable little prairie dogs that sculpt the prairies, and the beaver that kind of do the same thing for the waterways. So we can see again that the prairies are, or at least should be, this hotspot of biodiversity. There should be lots and lots and lots of animals, big animals, all the way down to small animals, flying animals, slithering animals, swimming animals, grass-eating animals, meat-eating animals, you name it, all of that did and should exist on these North American prairies. So where did all that prairie go? Well, unfortunately, that's kind of a sad story. And I won't get too much into the detail, but it has everything to do with the from everything of Native American removal and even genocide on the plains to the mass slaughter of animals like the bison. In the bottom left there, you can see a man standing on a tower of bison skulls. Those bison were killed for food and sometimes for parts. We used the leather to make belts and stuff, but oftentimes we were just killing them to kill them or to subjugate the Native American. So now we've lost two of our most iconic prairie species, human beings, Native Americans, Plains Indians, and the bison. Shortly after that, you see the trapping out of many mammals like beavers for reasons as silly as just creating men's hats. And then you see big introductions of cattle that were introduced to the land, didn't survive quite as well. In big winters, we had massive die-offs of cattle. People tried to farm out there for a while, and the farming was often done in unsustainable ways that led towards soil degradation, habitat degradation, dust bowl effects. And then at the top right there, you can see a dam, that's Fort Peck Dam, which indicates the damming of many of our big, big streams and waterways in North America, which holding back all that water has a huge effect on the hydrology, or just the way water works in an ecosystem. So lots of factors here, lots of things contributing to the fact that we don't really see those North American prairies, not like we would have even 200 years ago. But it really just boils down to this. Now this graph shows different ecosystems. On the left there, as you move down that graph, you can see listed of different types of ecosystems, everything from like mangroves down there at the bottom, which is kind of like the forests basically that live right at the land's edge and go into the water where the salt water meets the fresh water, provides habitat for lots of like fishes and other smaller land mammals. We've done a really good job of protecting that ecosystem. You can see worldwide, we've protected something like 25% of mangrove forests. That's great. But if you go all the way up to the top of that graph, you'll see temperate grasslands, savannas, and shrublands. Now, again, if you remember, those are basically the same things as prairies. Those are grasslands. We didn't do a very good job of protecting them, and globally, we're at less than 5% protection in the entire world. Part of that is because grasslands make really, really good places to farm or to raise cows. And we did a really good job in North America or in the United States when we were creating the national park system of protecting places like Yellowstone or Glacier National Park or Grand Canyon National Park, places with really impressive geological features, stuff like Old Faithful, big mountains, big glaciers, giant canyons like in the Grand Canyon. We didn't do a very good job, and partly because it was already gone, of protecting these prairie habitats that would have been not as geologically interesting, no mountains, no glaciers anymore, but really, really biodiverse, rich places full of wildlife. Now, this graph's really, really confusing, and I don't want you to get too caught up in this, but basically what I want to talk about here with this graph that I'm showing is just that even once we let those ecosystems, our prairies, our grasslands go back, even if we farmed them and then try to let them kind of rewild themselves, either actively or passively by replanting native plants or just allowing them to come back in, native plants and weeds with wind dispersal of seeds, we see that those grasslands are still, even after 100 years, which is what these graphs are showing, not as good at doing what they should do. The graph on the left shows biodiversity, which I already talked about. Remember, that's just the number of different plant species that are out there. And we see that after 100 years, you still don't have 100% of the biodiversity. You're still missing species that should be there. And then on the right, this is a little bit more complicated, but if you want to make it really simple, productivity is just how good those plant species are, that community of all those different plant species, of taking the sun's energy and making that available as food to large animals. So everything from grazers that eat the grass to the carnivores that eat the grazers. That's just how much energy conversion we get, and then therefore how much wildlife these places can support. And we see a vast, vast decline in that, even after 100 years. Fast forwarding, or to complicate matters even more, what we see is a lack of heterogeneity. And that's a big word, but I don't use it lightly. And I want to talk about what that means, because it's a word that I think about a lot as a prairie ecologist. So what is heterogeneity? Well, it basically just means different stuff. It's diversity, if you're familiar with that word. It's how different that place is. And when we talk about grasslands, what we mean by heterogeneity or diversity is just how many different types of grasslands height are there? Is there really, really grass? Is there medium grass? Is there tall grass and shrubs? All of that are important habitats for different wildlife. And a long, long time ago, the bison used to do a very good, bison and fire really did a very, very good job of maintaining all those different, that heterogeneity of grass height, super short grass, medium grass, really tall grass, all of that was there. And that's really important for a lot of different species. What we get when we replace bison, our native grazer, with cattle, and particularly the way we manage cattle, is homogeneity, the lack of diversity, one type of grass height. You just get medium grass. You don't get really, really short grass. You don't get really, really tall grass and shrubs and stuff like that. Now, for some species, this graph shows birds. There are some species that really like medium grass, the kind of grass that we maintain with cows. And those species are doing really, really well. Things like the lark bunting or the meadow lark, you can see those really readily. There's other species of bird, in this case, that require really short or like almost no grass, things that are mowed down to the ground by bison or prairie dogs. Things like the mountain plover. There's just not a lot of that type of habitat left. We lost that heterogeneity, diversity. And so we've degraded the system, our ecosystem, our prairie ecosystem's ability to support lots and lots of wildlife. And we can see, again, that indication of how large the scale of was there by looking at this graph. And in light green there, you can see that bison, again, the United States as national mammal, used to graze almost the entire continent, from like way down south in Mexico all the way up north in Canada. This was our lawnmower, our species that just kept those grasslands in check, managed for that heterogeneity, made sure that some grass was short, some grass was tall, and some grass was only medium. If you look at the dark green on that graph that you can see, there's almost no bison left. We almost lost the bison completely. And in most of the light green where you don't have bison, you now have cows that are managing for that homogeneity. Now, are cows bad? No, cows are not bad. But cows don't manage the grasslands, or we don't manage cows to manage the grasslands the same way that bison would have done on their own. And so you get that degradation, that change of the ecosystem from supporting lots and lots of wildlife to not so many wildlife. In addition to that, if we look at the actual animals that used to live on the plains, here we have 1800, when Lewis and Clark would have seen, when white people, European descendants would have seen the continent, the interior of the continent for the first time around 1800, the way that the Native Americans and the first peoples had enjoyed it for at least 10,000 years. We would have seen that same richness, the same picture that I showed you before, all these large and medium-sized animals running around all over the place, tons and millions of bison, and then predators, small, large carnivores, medium carnivores, lots and lots of different grazers. Fast forward to 1885, just 85 years later, we already see that we've lost the grizzly bear from the plains. The bison is now gone from the plains. There's almost no beaver, again, largely because people were trapping them to make hats. Fast forward a little bit farther, you've lost all of your large carnivores. There's no more wolves, grizzly bears, cougars. You don't really see any Native Americans anymore. You've replaced Native American hunters with white hunters. The bison, again, are gone. We're starting to lose more species like the swift fox, our little indigenous native fox. 25 years later, we lose the black-footed ferret as well. We thought it was completely extinct, gone from the planet until it was later rediscovered, all the way up to 2000 when things started to look a little bit better, but still aren't the way they were. The cougar, the mountain lion, has done a pretty good job of getting back to that ecosystem, all on its own. The black-footed ferret we rediscovered and were able to reintroduce, and so they're still not doing well. They're really, really endangered, but they're not gone, and that's important. None of this stuff is gone completely. Grizzly bears and wolves still exist. They just don't exist in the plains. The swift fox still exists, just not in the part of the plains that I work in. All of these animals are still around. They're just oftentimes not there. So that's kind of a bummer, right? I mean, it's a sad story when you talk about prairie ecology. I don't want to talk about a sad story. I'd rather talk about an uplifting or a hopeful story. And that's where I get to talk about what I do now. I had to set the stage and tell that kind of bummer of a story to explain why it is that I work for a place called American Prairies, or as a wildlife restoration manager, or a wildlife restoration ecologist, a rewilding ecologist. We're trying to put that back, at least in one small part of the plains. This is a zoom in of a part of Montana where I work, and a place that we're trying to put that ecosystem back together. Manage it in such a way where that biodiversity, that richness of species can flourish once again, and you and everybody else can come and enjoy it and see bison and see elk and bighorn sheep and maybe someday wolves and grizzly bears and all those other animals that used to call this place home in their natural abundances, big giant herds, just like they have in Africa, but our own animals here in North America. And so to drive that point home a little bit, I'd like to show you a video here real quick that some of the folks, the brilliant people I get to work with, came up with. I think it's very good. I hope you enjoy it too. It's about 4.5 minutes. And then as soon as this is done, I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. Okay, here we go.
What I want my son to learn is that people need nature and we can live in harmony with it. This project is only one of 4 places where we can save a temperate grassland, one of the least protected ecosystems in the world. We are losing a lot of wild places in the world, and what we're providing is a wild place for people to come out.
American Prairie Reserve is in a region that has been shaped by wildlife and people for millennia. We have a chance to preserve and protect that for the generations that follow us.
It would be the largest wildlife reserve in the continental United States, roughly the size of Connecticut, or equivalent to Yellowstone National Park and Glacier National Park put together.
This project brings together diverse people from diverse backgrounds who all can make an individual contribution to the building of American Prairie Reserve.
I'm a wildlife researcher. I'm very passionate about what I do. I'm out here because I wanted to be in a pristine place. I wanted to be part of a big project that has a meaning, not only to my small research, but globally something that's much bigger than me.
National Geographic has named American Prairie Reserve as one of their last wild places. So we're not just doing wildlife restoration, ecosystem restoration here for the sake of this landscape. We're actually doing it to serve as a model for the world.
They're both adult females.
The gaze is forward. The projection is forward. This is a modern vision of modern humanity living alongside and coexisting with big, robust, healthy populations of wildlife.
Whoops.
Wanting to create a spot where the world is welcome, it's monumental, it's brave, and to watch people realize, almost look like they accidentally found something they didn't even know that they were looking for.
This place is a living, breathing entity already. We are not waiting for this place to be fully assembled in order to welcome the public to come out and enjoy it.
When I come out here, I do get very inspired. Protecting this land, not just here, but everywhere around the world, is important.
This is a project of national and global importance that we at American Prairie Reserve cannot do alone. And it's a vital part of what our country will be for generations to come.
All is I get the pleasure to work on, and some of the really interesting folks that I get to work with, and it's really a treat. And so what we're trying to do again is just put that ecosystem back together, at least in one small part of where it used to exist. So the ecosystem can be healthy and people can come see it. This is very important to me. People can come enjoy the prairies as they used to be. So with that, I think I've covered what I want to cover, and I do want to give you guys a chance to ask any questions if you have them.
All right, perfect. Well, first of all, welcome back, Danny. Thank you for that awesome presentation. I especially like the way you had the animals up and showed us how things changed over the years. It's hard to watch to see so many species disappearing from that ecosystem, but it is good to see that in more recent times that some of those animals are being reintroduced and making their way back into the ecosystem, which makes the work you're doing so important. So thank you for the work that you're doing to help make that happen. All right, well, we've got a great group of classrooms joining us from across North America. So start sending in your questions via the chat sidebar and introduce yourselves. And we're going to start meeting some of our camera classrooms as well. So let me just make sure that I have the right one ready. There we go. So we're going to start off. We're going to visit with Mrs. Fisher's group. They're in Carsonville, Michigan. Looks like some third graders hanging out with us. Let's get that microphone turned on. How are we doing, Michigan?
Good.
All right. Do you have a question for Danny about the grasslands, the prairie, the work he does? We're ready for you.
What I was wondering about that is it was pretty sad watching all the animals going away. No.
Yeah, it is kind of sad.
Go
Sorry,
ahead.
what was that?
That's more of a comment than a question.
Oh, that's okay. I think that's a smart comment, and that's a reaction that I share. Part of the reason that I do why I do is because I do find that sad, but I also think that there's hope in that. The really inspiring thing to me about this is that, like I said, all those animals still exist. I think there's like one bug. There's like a cicada or something that's extinct, and we'll never get that back. But beyond that, all the bison and the bighorn sheep and the elk and the moose and everything else, it's all still around. It's just not there. And so the work of putting that back together actually looks doable. This isn't gone forever. It was almost gone forever, but it's not now, and we can put that back together. So yeah, it is kind of sad, but it's also kind of hopeful, because we're doing our best to put that back together so people can enjoy that again. And the good news is, I don't want to brag, but I think we're doing a pretty good job. We're getting there. This is coming. You can visit American Prairie Reserve now and see some of this stuff. The bison are back. There's not a lot of them, but there's some of them. And we're going to continue to grow those bison and welcome in more wildlife as it starts to come back. So yeah, it's sad, but there's a silver lining.
All right. I think that just drives the point home that, you know, a lot of people don't know the story. They don't know what's happened, and they don't know what's happening today to try and undo the damage done. So that's why events like this, the work you do getting out to the community and sharing stories and such like that, that's why it's so important. So before we pop away from Mrs. Fisher's class, I think I saw someone else in the back with their hands up. So if you do have a question in the back, we can take it, or we can swing back to your classroom, but I think I see them coming up. Oh, and Mrs. Fisher, if you don't mind unmuting for me, I think you might have muted the mic on us. Perfect.
Are prairie dogs still in the prairies?
Yes, they are. There are still prairie dogs, and I did not talk too much about prairie dogs, but they are very, very important. It's easy to think about bison, big national mammal, super charismatic, fun animal to talk about. But really, the prairie dogs are probably just as important as the bison for the health of that ecosystem. Now, prairie dogs were never gone completely, but they're at about 2% of their historic range, which means they're 2 out of every 100 prairie dog towns is still around, is still in existence. So they're not doing very well. There's a number of reasons for that, but one of the things that the American Prairie Reserve is working really hard on is trying to get those prairie dog numbers back up so that they can get to work mowing the grasslands alongside of the bison and creating habitat for all those bird species and all those other mammal species and all the little forbs and plant species that really rely on that animal. So yeah, prairie dogs never gone. And thankfully, because they're really, really important for our ecosystem. They do a lot of work, and we really need them to come back and get to work, rebuilding that ecosystem for the other animals to enjoy. Good question.
All right. We've got a classroom that's joining us live on YouTube. I think it's Mr. Barnes' class, and they're in New Albany, Ohio. It looks like some 5th graders. And so they sent us a question, Danny. They are working on a little project. So I just want to make sure I get it right. So they're in New Albany, Ohio, and they're planting a pocket prairie on their school campus this school year. So they're really excited about that. They're excited to learn about the prairie reserve that you work in. And they're wondering if you have any ideas for controlling weeds as their prairie gets established over the next couple of years.
That is a fantastic question. And I am afraid I am not the right person to answer it for you. You got to see Ellen in the beginning of that video. She's kind of our botanist at the Prairie Reserve. And Lars, actually, who does a lot of the weed management on the Prairie Reserve. So really, really large scale. And so I want to help you guys out managing the weeds in your little rewilding patch of prairie there in Ohio. That sounds like a very cool project, but I'm afraid I don't have any specific recommendations for you right now. I'm sure we can follow up at the end of this, but I am on Twitter and Facebook and all those other places. My email and phone number are available on the internet, and I would be more than happy to put you in touch with the people that can give you the right answers to those questions and help you put that place, help you restore that little patch of prairie there in Ohio. That's just a fantastic project. I wish you good luck with that.
All right, perfect. So I know offhand at Daniel Kinka is an easy spot to reach you on Twitter, but it sounds like if they go to the Prairie Reserve, they can find a little more detail as well if they want to dig in, if they go to the website. Perfect. Okay. We are going to visit Morris, Illinois this time. We've got some 6th graders hanging out with Mrs. Aldrich. Let me get their microphone turned on. There we go. How are we doing, 6th graders?
We're doing pretty good.
Hi, guys.
Okay. Have you noticed any movement patterns among the animals of the prairie?
What do you mean by movement patterns? What are you curious about?
I mean, I'm curious about like how they act around the prairie and how they act around certain things and movement patterns between them and between the animals that you've seen.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
migration patterns.
Yep, very good, very good. And yes, that is something we think a lot about. In fact, we're getting ready to, just next week, we'll be putting a bunch of little earrings in some of our bison, they're little GPS ear tags that go in the ear of the bison as opposed to a collar. And that allows us to track their movement around the prairie. So myself and some of the researchers, one of whom you saw in the video, Dr. Hila Shamoon, will be looking at that to see how do bison actually use the landscape, which to your question, how do they move? You know, remember when I talked about heterogeneity of grasslands? Well, the bison need to move in a specific way in order to keep some of the grass really, really short and allow others parts of the grass to get long. And all of that is related to how bison move across the landscape. So in order to understand that, we have to watch where they go around the pasture, around the prairie, to see how they're using that. So we as scientists can learn more about how bison move and how that fits into the biodiversity and the management of the prairies. There's also other species like pronghorn, which I don't even think I really talked about in my talk. Really incredible animal. It's basically a mammalian dinosaur out there. It's been around for thousands of years. And they have some of the largest migrations of any North American mammal. They walk a long, long way to get from one place to another, from one feeding ground to the next. And we know that that's really, really important for both managing the grasslands, but it's also important, of course, for that pronghorn species. And now what the pronghorn is not very good at, although it's very good at a lot of things, is navigating fences, barbed wire fence. That pronghorn evolved on an open grassland prairie with no borders, no walls. And so when a pronghorn encounters a fence nowadays, it has to walk around it or figure something else out. They're not very good jumpers, and they're not very good at going underneath it if the fence is too low. So that's another example where movement's really, really important. And we want to know how that works because we want to make sure that our pronghorn are happy and healthy and able to get from A to B so that they can complete that large migration. We're also looking at how birds like the curlew migrate from the Prairie Reserve all the way down to Mexico and back, all kinds of fun stuff. So it's a very smart question, and it is something that ecologists like myself, many more of us, look a lot at all the time is how do animals move on this landscape, and what does that mean for the ecology of the place? Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you.
My pleasure.
All right, perfect. So we're going to jump to our next group. We're going to visit with, let me see if I can get the mic going. Ms. Wafer, I'm going to have to ask you to unmute for me, but I'll introduce you while you do that. So Ms. Wafer is in Westchester, and she is joining us from Laurel Springs School. They're an online school with students joining from all over the place. And Ms. Wafer, I bet you have a question or two for us that the students have sent in so far.
As you can imagine, I do. So, and they're about prairie dogs. Or things on the prairie. So Emily is wondering, she's in 5th grade, she's from Sacramento, California. She's wondering if you've ever helped hurt animals on the prairie. And then Caden, who's in Oklahoma in 7th grade, is wondering if you've seen a prairie dog town.
Well, Caden, I am happy to tell you that I get to see prairie dog towns all the time. I'm not on the reserve right now, but when I am up there, there are a lot of happy, healthy prairie dogs on big towns, and they're doing just fine. And it is really fun to watch them out and about. Even now, there's not that much snow up there right now, so they're still out and about and happy on top of the snow. If we get more snow, they'll stay underground until the spring, until it melts off. But yes, I get to see prairie dogs all the time, and all the other species that live on prairie dog towns, like burrowing owls and prairie rattlesnakes and all kinds of different animals and little plant species that call that place home as well. So yes, I do, and it is one of the perks of my job. To the first question, do I herd animals? Was it like move them around?
Oh no, wondering if you ever helped herd animals, if you come across a bison or something, or an animal that's been
injured. Okay. Yes. We've got people that are much better and smarter about it than me that work at the Prairie Reserve that are usually doing the kind of bison moving them around when we have to. But most of the time we want those animals to exist as much like wildlife as possible. So they go where they want to go and they eat what they want to eat. But every now and then we need to, like I said, coming up, we got to put hands on the bison so I can put on those earrings and necklaces and stuff like that so I can track these animals around. That requires us to move the animals through a corral system, at least briefly, so that we can, take blood samples, make sure the animals are happy and healthy, disease-free, and also use some of this technology to track them. So I do get to help with that, and I will be helping with that just next week, and it is really a fun thing to do. We try to be very respectful and make sure that there's very little stress, or as little stress on the animals as possible. That's important to us, but it is a really neat thing to be able to be that close to a bison. So yeah, sometimes I do get to help with that. They let me help.
Yeah, and what about Danny, if a bison is injured or something, do you guys kind of let nature take its course, or because there's so few of them, do you guys intervene?
We don't. At this point, we have a herd of about 800 bison currently in a couple different, total bison in about 3 different places. And we try to let nature take its course. It's not always the nicest thing to talk about or the nicest thing to see, but it is important. Particularly, it's important that when an animal dies out there in the landscape, it gets to stay where it died, and the nutrients that make up that animal get to go back into the system, and that scavengers are able to come and harvest off of that animal. That's important for other species to have that dead animal in the landscape. And so yeah, we do try to let nature take its course, so to speak. What did Tennyson say? Nature's red in tooth and claw. It's not always the nicest thing out there, but it is really important. And there's a kind of a beauty to that cyclical nature of nature, that cyclicalness of nature as well when you think about it. So yeah, we try to let the animals just be wild animals.
All right, absolutely. I mean, life and death, it's part of a healthy ecosystem. It's just the way it works. Okay, let's jump back to Mrs. Fisher's group and see in Michigan if they have one more question for us today. I think I see someone coming.
What happens if one of the bison you put the necklace on gets attacked and the tracker goes in one of the other animal's stomach?
So this is a good question, actually. It's rare, but it is not impossible. Now the bison collars, the necklaces that the bison wear, they're very, very big. they're like this big. So it'd be really hard for that to end up in the stomach of another animal. Also, it's important to note that we don't have our large carnivores back there on the landscape. I mentioned that there's cougars or mountain lions, but mountain lions don't usually hunt bison. What we think of as hunting and killing and eating bison are either wolves or grizzly bears, at least seasonally when the bison are small. And we don't have any wolves or grizzly bears on the Prairie Reserve right now. So we would like to, That's an important part of the ecosystem, but it's not there right now. So there's nothing to actually eat a bison and consume a collar. Now, sometimes people come out and hunt the bison and harvest it for food for themselves, and they can eat that as well. But most people know enough to not eat the collar. Now, putting out these little bison ear tags that are going out there, hopefully I'll be able to pick them up. If that animal dies, go out there and get them pretty quickly. But I guess it's not outside of the realm of possibility that one of those ear tags could end up in something's stomach. I hope not, but we'll see.
All right. Mrs. Aldrich's class, let's turn your microphone on. I know you guys have another one.
How has the change of the prairie ecosystem affected us today?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for one, well, there's a lot of, I mean, we can talk about a lot of things that changed. If we were all alive and living in North America just a few hundred years ago, certainly 1,000 years ago, and we were all indigenous to the landscape, we wouldn't have eaten really cows because cows didn't exist. We'd be eating bison or other things that had existed on the landscape. Very few people have the privilege or the luck of being able to eat bison anymore these days. Most of us eat cattle. That's fine. I like hamburgers and steaks and stuff like that, but that has changed the way our diets exist as people in North America. It also has a very serious aesthetic effect, which means we don't get to see the prairie anymore. There's very few places where you can go and see. There's some little places where people are trying to carve back spots for nature, not just American Prairie Reserve, but the Nature Conservancy and some other places throughout the continent. But you can't see that. And so one of the biggest effects that I worry about and the concerns that I have is it's really hard to care about a place that you can't see. You can't love it if you can't imagine it, and you can't imagine it if you haven't ever seen it. I think it's difficult anyways. That's why a big part of my presentation was trying to get you guys to imagine that. I think it's important that we think about bison and pronghorn and grizzly bears on the grasslands of North America as just as important as the water buffalo and the rhinoceros and the leopards and cheetahs and lions that exist elsewhere. It's important that we have that species richness. That's something that we can be proud of as the natural heritage of the place that we are from. I think that's really important. And I think the lack of that has contributed to just not as much awareness of biodiversity and big, rich mammal systems in North America. It's got a big effect on how the water works in this place. I mentioned all the dams that are up in the prairies. It used to flood all the time. We used to have beaver running all over the place in this continent. There's not that many their beaver are still around, but there's not nearly as many of them as there were. And what looks like desert today might have looked like a wetland not that long ago because of the way that the water worked and the lack of dams and the lack of man-made dams and the existence of beaver dams. I could go on and on about this, but I don't want to. It's a good question, and I think there's a lot of ways that it has impacted our lives today. The one that I worry about the most is just the lack of pride and interest in our North American ecosystems, which I love so dearly, and I want others to feel the same about.
All right. And then we're going to jump to Mrs. Wafer one more time, see if she has some questions from her online group. If you don't mind just turning the mic on for me.
Absolutely. Yeah, so we have a couple of questions about how often, this is from Madison, she's a 7th grader in Charlotte, North Carolina. How often are you able to get onto the prairie? And what's the temperature range? You said it was such, it's as big as Connecticut, I think you said. What are the temperatures on the prairie?
Well, it will, just a point of clarification, when we're done, it will be about the size of Connecticut or Yellowstone and Glacier combined. It's not that big right now, but that's what we're shooting for. So the area that we live and work in is very big. I get to be up there all the time. I'm not on the prairie right now, but I'm there quite a bit. And it is a big highlight of my job to get to spend so much time in such an incredible place where just not a lot of people go. The temperature can fluctuate wildly. So it is not unheard of for it to get as low as -40 degrees Fahrenheit, same as -40 degrees Celsius, so I know that one, and as high as probably 120 degrees. That's extreme, but it's not unheard of to get that high above Fahrenheit. So what is that, like, I don't know, 40+ degrees centigrade or something like that. It varies wildly, and the amount of precipitation, whether it's rain or snowfall that we get, varies quite a bit. It is a landscape of extremes for sure.
All right. Well, first of all, I want to give a big shout out to our classrooms. Thank you so much for tuning in with us today, both on YouTube and on camera with us. Thanks for the awesome questions. And Danny, it's always great to be able to host you. In the past, we've done one from outside, close to the prairie dog town. So hopefully we'll be able to do some really cool stuff from the field as spring comes and the weather warms up. So we're looking forward to some future events. And then we have one more question just squeaked in from Mrs. Aldrich's group. They typed it to me. They're wondering about your favorite animal on the prairie. Do you have a favorite?
That's a tough question. I'll give you two, because I have a favorite bird and a favorite mammal. My favorite bird, and I did show a picture of it very briefly, although I didn't name it, is the short-eared owl. I like that bird a lot. It's very charismatic. Its face looks like an emoji. It looks mean, but it's not. They have a very cool way of flying. Their courtship flying is very, very interesting. And uniquely, they're an owl that's oftentimes out during the daylight, so not too difficult to see. So I really, really do enjoy seeing the short-eared owls. They're one of my favorites. When it comes to a mammal, they exist now, but I've always had a soft spot for coyotes. I think they're kind of an incredible species. They're amazingly resilient. They've been persecuted for hundreds of years and have done nothing but expand their range. They can be found in the subways of Chicago all the way out to the plains and in the mountains. They're just an extraordinary species that can live in packs and be solitary animals. They're incredible. And as somebody that used to do some studying of wild canids or wild dogs, I'm a big fan of the coyote. So those are my two favorites, at least for now.
All right, perfect. Well, Daniel, thanks so much. We look forward to some future hangouts. And the last thing we'll do today is I'll turn on the microphones. We'll let the classrooms give a quick goodbye and thank you, and then we'll sign off for today. So let me just hit those microphones, boys and girls. You want to say goodbye and thank you, and then we'll sign off. So here we go. Microphones are on.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks again, everyone, for hanging out. Thanks, Danny, for another awesome presentation. And I hope everybody enjoys the rest of your week. So signing off for today.